Thanks a lot, Tiziana, and also thanks again, Judy, for your very interesting rejuvenations of the debate on labor and work in the context of digital media. And your talks have shown that the notion of labor and work is still both, on the one hand, a potential lever for critique, especially when it is used, as Tiziana does it, as rather as a political choice of terminology. But your talks also have shown that both terms don't necessarily sit as neatly in the context of digital media as in their kind of early Marxist forms of critique of labor and work, and they constantly require us to revisit the specific conditions of digital capture infrastructures. So I would like to open the discussion by bringing up a point that has already been brought up in the previous session, and that is the question of data extraction, recombination, and recontextualization, and the question about value that emerge from that. And I have very specific questions for both of you regarding this. So in his very interesting work on relational databases, Adrian Mackenzie, for instance, claims that it's not the individual data points that matter, but the relations that can be created between them. And especially in your revisited version of free labor, Tiziana, you stress that digital labor is very much less interested in normalization than in the inclusion of any kind of abundant production of data, content or relations produced in the interest to, and here I quote you, to the point where practically anything is tolerated. So obviously Facebook cares very little whether we like Obama or Palin, and advertising trackers don't mind if we go to Wikipedia or to gambling sites. And the question that emerges here for me, especially for you, is if any data point can potentially become valuable and can potentially become into economic value for different kind of actors involved, not necessarily those who have produced it, what actually are the limits of valorization, and how can we think about forms of regulation here? Because this is a term that appeared in both of your talks. How can we think about regulation if anything can be turned valuable? And in relation to your specific perspective on time, Judy, the question that anything can potentially become valuable also means that the moment when it is becoming valuable is no longer in the kind of the time that can be measured as a form of labor time. If the data that users produce become valuable after they have been produced, how can we still kind of think about temporality of work and labor here if the work is eventually increasingly produced by algorithms and processing infrastructures? You also have one here. I think it's already on.
It's on already. Yes, I have read and been fascinated by these developments in data science. I'm thinking about Alex Pentland's book, Social Physics, where it is claimed that big data actually allows you to extract relations and forms which produce a kind of a new understanding of the laws of the social mechanisms. So that's part of it. What Adrian Mackenzie is talking about is related to that, of course, because these laws are extracted out of relations which are regular. So the whole is a very tricky act put into value a database, a relational database, because on the one hand you have to show there is regularity, so that it's reliable, it's scientific. So science becomes equated with that which is repeatable and trustworthy, and you can apply it again and again. It's a law, it's got universal value. At the same time, they have to come up with the idea that these laws are new. So their value is that they produce something new. They show relations that have never been shown before. They become evident through this kind of magicization of the social, because the social graph is a matrix before being a graph of nodes and edges. So it's a very tricky act. You know, you have to say there's something new here, and at the same time you have to say there's something universal. There's something that can always be applied. It's a law. So you're asking what is the limit of valorization there? The limit of valorization, I think, are in the fact there's level of uncertainties, risks, novelties, events that keep escaping this kind of data science. They keep escaping it, but then they're kind of continuously that which social networks are trying to incite in order to reabsorb. So that could be a kind of limit. And then regulation. What do you mean by that? You mean that actually regulation is something that we should think about if you're thinking about an alternative organization of social communication? Are you thinking about that in that terms?
No, I was rather thinking if any data point can potentially be of value, is there any necessity for platforms to govern users? And if so, into which direction, if anything is potentially valuable?
Well, it seems to me that you keep using these terms. It's like harvest, farm. So that platforms in the short history of the social internet have become the means to kind of collect and bring together, you know, all these data points in a kind of process of domestication, almost, of values produced by this kind of communication. If you compare them to platforms like Unix, before, you know, it's clear that the platform is something that allows the kind of collection of these data points, and also you've shown with your work as well, and Anne, how this has been a way to remold the web. It's turned the web into something different than this kind of network of linked documents and pages that we knew. It has centralized, it has been the back door of centralization. I don't know if this answers. Yeah.
I'm on slightly different wavelength, I think, than both of you. So I'll just respond how I understood the questions, but it's probably completely on a different thing. I mean, I worry that some of this discussion about algorithms is too abstracted, actually. And I just like to give a couple of quick examples. I mean, a lot of my colleagues now work on high-frequency trading, and they try and apply a science and technology studies perspective to understand the financial crisis. And one of the things they do is very much critique the notion that the problem with the financial crash was algorithms, that you can blame a particular technical set of algorithms for the problem. And they very much stress, actually, that there is a lot of regulation in the financial industry. There isn't enough, but actually even something like high-frequency trading that seems very abstract and very virtual only operates because of rating agencies, because of electricity, tubes, you know, all sorts of regulations. And I'm worried about having completely abstracted conversations about these things as if they're free-floating, I guess. And there's even regulations about the speed, you know, where the data points can be so that there's not unfair competition and various things like this. And secondly, what your question made me think of is that, you know, I think one of the things Morozov's doing very well at the moment, and he probably talked about it in the session before that I didn't hear, was just to sort of simply say, look, actually, you know, the problem is not sort of big data, it's that people think of big data first and social problems second. Actually, big data can be very useful for social problems if they're used for social problems. The problem is, and I think social scientists have been seduced into this too, that loads of people now at Goldsmiths, at various places, have gone on to this fashion of let's all do big data, as if in itself, it isn't a very political choice to make to do research on big data, rather than thinking about social problems, as you say, what are the values, what's the, you know, what do we want society to be like, and then think of how we can use sort of big data for that. So I'm sort of slightly worried about the abstraction of these questions, actually, the free-floatingness of the discussion.
Yeah, that's what I also got from both of your talks, that you were on the one hand interested in expanding the notion of work and labor, and you were addressing also the expanding data capture processes, but at the same time you were interested in the question of where do we draw boundaries, on the one hand for the concept of work and labor, but also boundaries in terms of what can be recombined, and how shall researchers themselves also engage with recombining these data points that can be engaged with. One thing that both of your talks also kind of pointed towards me, and that I would like to kind of go further a little bit, is the question of asymmetry here, which appears on a number of levels. So I think in one way I had to think about asymmetry in relation to your engagement with time, when you said that, yeah, digital media produce temporal experiences of acceleration and speeding up, and that it is indeed that the interfaces of real-time streams, tickers, and popping up notifications constantly require users to attend to new content at speeded up time. However, there is another asymmetry involved here that that maybe should be also addressed, and that is the fact that this is the kind of temporality produced through the front ends of the interfaces of social media, whereas those who basically program the interfaces, who have access to the data, who make the data accessible for analysts and companies, deal with a very different form of temporality. And this kind of bifurcation of real-time interfaces with an archival drive in the back end, as the media theorist Robert Gale describes it, creates a very strong asymmetry in access to temporal conditions that is being created for users and producers of data points and producers of data recombination algorithms. And maybe you want to say a bit more about this asymmetry.
I'm sorry. Well, I mean, I think you're completely right about this, and what it brings to mind is the old technology of the car, you know, and Raymond Williams has this fantastic image, I think, where he talks about, you know, on the one hand, the dream of the 20th century was the speed of the car. You know, speed of the car was freedom, was sexy, was all of these things, and yet actually in a car one is sedentary in a closed box. You know, he just kind of has this very nice image of the different, and I think of it in terms of this image of surfing the web, that actually we're much more sedentary in a corporeal way, that we're sitting, and yet the image is of surfing, and it's like with the car that one is sitting and moving. And I mean, I try and, in my book, and I don't know how successfully, talk about the, you know, the slow and fast as really being a dialectical relationship, that some things speed up and some things slow down. And, you know, Paul Virilio as well has this very nice image about, you know, on the one hand there's this, you know, instantaneous speed, and on the other hand there's gridlock, you know, that one is sitting in traffic jams, that one is stuck in airports. Actually, I was in Heathrow this morning for 2.5 hours, you know, so I think all the time there's the fast and slow dynamic. I don't at all think that we're in this trajectory of speeding up.
Yeah, asymmetries are everywhere. Asymmetries are everywhere. I think starting with asymmetry, there is this whole polemic against the Occupy movements, right? Saying that they all had this fetishism of horizontality, and that everybody had to be equal. But actually, you know, if you actually look at these experiences of voluntary technological assisted coordination, asymmetries are everywhere. So it's I think it's a quite crucial concept. And yeah, it's fascinating how all these different technologies have different temporalities which engage you differently. There's one of my favorite comic strip author, Zero Calcare, is an Italian kind of blog internet sensation. Did this comic strip about, I used it in one of my articles, about him trying to, he had to do some work, he had a deadline, and then he logged onto Facebook for just, he said, 5 minutes before I start working. And then he found himself like 6 hours later, having missed all deadlines. And he talks about this hypnotic function built into Facebook, which is activated after 8 p.m. And then when you log in, you're just sucked in. So there is that element of the front end, which is with this novelty for the internet. Maybe, yeah, IRC had something like that. It was the chat protocol where conversation were constantly streaming. So it was like this rain of information. And then you could just enjoy the stream, and things didn't pile up as with email. Email has got this kind of bottom where things pile up, and that contributes to the anxiety, while social media have taken that from the chat channels, this kind of feelings of the stream, so that makes you feel relaxed. But then on the other side, so your temporality is flowing. On the other side, it's, again, as you said, it's a different matter. So the back-end, front-end asymmetry of social networks is something that is really interesting to think also in terms of the perception that people who actually use the social media have of what is going on. You know, is it like television for them? So is it kind of flat screen? Or is there any conception of everything that goes on behind? What kind of social and technical labor is mobilized in this big data bank with all these new jobs being created and competencies in handling data sets? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and the notion of asymmetry could also be extended into the question that you addressed in relation to pleasure and exploitation. But maybe this is a topic that the audience wants to bring up. We would now like to open the floor to questions from the audience to bring into the discussion. There are 2 microphones in the aisles. Maybe we can have some lights on them again so we can see who's talking to us. And yeah, if you have some questions, please make use of the microphones. Yeah, there's someone over there.
Hi, I'd just like to say it's absolutely fantastic to see an all-woman panel. Absolutely. Congratulations to Transmediale. And thank you very much for an awesome session. One thing that I was thinking about as you were talking, that came from all 3 of you, was talking about quite a tension in between this change of economy and use of time. And was, sorry, one thing that I was reminded of as you were talking about quite this tension between production and value and time was a quote from the writer William Gibson, who said that he feels that America's currently under what he describes as a cold civil war. And I wondered whether you thought that perhaps this change in production and value has something to do with that.
What does he mean by that? Sorry. What does he mean by that? Just give us another sentence.
I think what he's talking about is that within what's going on and the tensions between all of the different parts of American society, yes, and the structure of it is essentially a civil war, but enacted in a very, very glacially slow way. Just like we saw the Cold War was a completely new kind of protracted, slow warfare.
Yes.
You do. Good. Go.
Well, after finishing my first book, and kind of only book until now, I'm working on another one, I was totally drawn into Michel Foucault's lectures, which were just published in the mid-2000s. And the genealogy, they are very interesting to me. For 2 years, I just read those. You know, it's really good when you can just get lost in a book and you're absorbed in a book. And it was very, because he was kind of changing things, you know, it was making me seeing things in a different way. And especially the notion of kind of society. Now, we take for granted that we know that society is a stable thing, right? It's kind of always existed. But looking at the 18th century, he saw how the notion of society, and especially civil society, was actually emerging at the same time as you had the notion of the market being developed. So theorists of the markets and theorists of civil society were actually pretty much connected, right? So you had, on the one hand, you had the logic of the market, which produced a fair price and was based on individual self-interest, and it was the first automaton, you know, which works through the invisible hand. And then on the other hand, you had the social and society, which was more risky because he had sympathies and antipathies. He had war built into it. The social was not homogeneous, you know. So the kind of nation state was a way to kind of keep at bay, through the social contract, Hobbes, this kind of intrinsic, warlike nature of society, right? And it's interesting that Adam Ferguson, who wrote at the same time as Adam Smith, should talk about society in this, in terms which are critical of Hobbes, the notion that, you know, war is the natural status of human beings, and then you have a social contract which brings peace, to think about civil society as this kind of mixture of sociability and conflict, which is about, you know, people that we feel closer to and similar to and we can identify with, and others. Now, if you have a polarization such as we had of income and wealth and value appropriation, you have a new configuration of class, right, which is happening. And this polarization is creating an atmosphere of civil war. Low intensity civil war. I mean, I cannot think about what's happened to Greece, whom I wish good luck, you know, after recent election, as a kind of inter-European civil war, you know, brought about with economic means. When Saskia Sassen talks about expulsions, and she says these have become a kind of the way to deal with residue of production, with that which cannot be put to value, so it's just expelled and evicted and foreclosed. She's talking about this act of social warfare, which are presented as economic and as rational acts. So yeah, I think that it feels like there is a war going on. Although, as McNamara used to say, war, you know, Robert McNamara, war comes with its fog, and fog is always, the kind of confusion is always part of that.
Thank you. So, do we have other questions from the audience? Yes, over here.
Hi. I just wanted to ask how the topics discussed in the panel relate with other dynamics that are going on in the job market, specifically with the case of precarious workers.
Well, I think precarious workers are absolutely sort of central to all of this discussion, and and are part of this flexible temporality that we're now living, an unregularized temporality. And I think one of the things about traditional work that's very underspoken and understressed is that even kinds of work, and I mean we may disagree about this, but you know, even kinds of work that we may think of as not intrinsically very interesting work, very creative work, actually have a lot of social meaning for people. That what comes out of traditional work studies is that having some form of regular work is very important for identity, for social being, and that having, and it's clear that irregular work is shocking for all of those reasons. There's much more of a discussion, I think, coming up. I mean, we're having elections soon in Britain, and there's much more talk about a minimum wage. And actually, I have to say, which I have never done before, that my family joined the Green Party 2 days ago. You know, it was just one of those evenings I thought, yes, we'll do that. And they're very much trying to push, you know, what's a terrible, you know, Labour opposition in Britain, to thinking about strong, you know, a minimum wage, stronger work regulation, and some sort of citizens' pay. And I think there is much more a recognition of the problems with this, and much more activity around these things, actually. And I do think they profoundly affect, I mean, in terms of the discussions about sleep, I mean, it seems to me that the sleep is a big issue with irregular work and what that does to well-being, actually.
There was another question on that side.
Yes, I'm a bit stuck with asymmetry, and Judy, you said something about discussing with the Marxists in your teens, and that made me think that we always give our potential to society in one way or the other. I mean, there could be Marxists who got very inspired by your ideas and write books later on, and that's fine, because you give your ideas to the community. But with the asymmetry, I think there's this notion of abuse, and I think that the abuse by others. For example, if one of these Marxists would send you free literature on all kinds of theories to your home to read that, and it's very interesting, so you read that, and then he would connect you to other people to learn about new ideas, and you bring all this stuff to the discussion with him, and he gets much more inspired, and you would get stressed because of all the possibilities, and Hartmut Rosa is saying that we get stressed by the potential, by the possibilities. So I think that many big companies they're not just using the data we produce, but they're intentionally abusing us by creating this huge potential and the possibilities to draw us into it. And I think that's a much worse point, because you said we can decide how we use the technology, but we can't, because they use very mean psychological tricks to get us into producing data for them. And I think there's a very strong asymmetry and even an abuse in that.
Can I just say, yeah. I mean, I don't disagree with you at all. I suppose I always wonder about what's new about these things and how much it's to do with digitalisation. And for example, you know, while we've been talking about the quantification discussion and the quantification of algorithms, I'm thinking back to, certainly in Britain, the discussion about Britain becoming an accounting culture, and that there was a lot written by what we call critical accountants. Believe it or not, there are critical accountants in management schools in Britain, yeah, who have looked at how, you know, the kind of societies that we've been living in, you know, we're counting everything before this discussion about algorithms, you know, that in the National Health Service, that in academia, that in all of these things, there was much more quantification, much more performance measures. I mean, I think performance pay came in the 1970s, you know. So I think there's a long history of these forms of quantification and measurement and pressure, and I'm not sure myself, that's all I'm sort of trying to raise, what's new about the new forms that we're getting. I mean, it's much more efficient with big data, but I just wonder if the principles are radically altered. I suppose that I'm just sort of trying to raise that question, because I'm always trying to think about, I mean, I guess could I just sort of say quickly, you know, when I was writing the book, what really struck me was that I went back and read discussions about the telegraph, you know, which I had in the telegraph and the railways and all that stuff that I'm sure you know. But I was really struck by how much in those old discussions there's, you know, people are saying, you know, that there's an annihilation of time, and how are we going to, you know, experience things, and how radically this is going to change language. And I was just so struck by the parallels that I do try to keep a longer historical perspective in mind when trying to interpret, well, what exactly is happening with digitalisation.
Maybe I can expand that question to Tiziana, also following up on, the question, what is new or specific, and maybe that question can be approached along the line, where is the limit, the kind of asymmetry between pleasure and exploitation. So you say that the forms of labor involved in digital media involve both a pleasure of the user, but also potential forms of exploitation, but not necessarily. So at which point does exploitation kind of take over from pleasure, and at which point is this asymmetry no longer an asymmetry, but a detachment from each other? Is that happening? Is that no longer just asymmetrical, but even completely detached from each other?
You know, that thing about putting together pleasure and exploitation in free labor always bothered me, you know, after I read it. And I had no idea that, you know, the essay was going to become so popular, you know, let's say. And so that every single word of phrasing, you know, was going to receive so much attention. So linking pleasure and exploitation is reminiscent of 1970s debate about, you know, how we should do away with pleasure, because pleasure, for example, in watching Hollywood films, make you complicit with patriarchy, you know, and that pleasure is kind of the way to seduce you into becoming part of something that exploits you. So I don't want that, you know, I don't want that notion that pleasure, that's something that I disagree with Jody Dean about that. You know, she says we are drawn into social, into communicative capitalism through these little nuggets of pleasure that we get, through this hit that we get every time we get a new message, every time we hear this sound, every time we got this expectations of something good coming to us through social media. So I don't want to criminalize pleasure. I think that pleasure is good, actually. On the other hand, I cannot forget, you know, I learned since, because, you know, there's been further work and research, that pleasure and pain are absolutely crucial technologies of power in the whole tradition of economics. I mean, the subject of economics, Homo economicus, is the creature who is rational because understands the difference between pleasure, rewards, and pain, punishment. So it's a moral technology which takes pleasure into account, this calculation of responsibilities and consequences of action. I think it's Dardot and Laval in their book on the new reason of the world, on neoliberalism, who said that this kind of pleasure and pain are the first secular morality. So, you know, defense of pleasure, acknowledgement that pleasure is part of a technology of power, which, again, punishes you or rewards you, but also that there is a component of the other component of subjectivity is not just sensation, hence not just pleasure, but also it's quite important is belief. So belief is as an economic force, together with kind of pleasure and desire. There's something that the subjective element, I think there's something that should have been put there. When you kind of listen to theorists of social production, they assume that people do it for pleasure, and they call it motivation. And they assume they all believe in the same things. And on this basis, they're not exploited, right? So there's something interesting in that. Finally, exploitation, is this something that happens at the level of the single act of communication, or at the individual user? I always oppose the idea that it's an individual user which is exploited, or is this something that is reproduced as the general level of the whole economic organization? So it's not the individual user who is exploited, who's acting out of pleasure and on account of certain quantities of beliefs that they hold in social communication, but it's a whole process that it's exploited. And it's exploited because the value created in this process, it's accumulated and then invested in privatizing spaces which belong to everybody, like city spaces, which is what is happening. Saskia Sassen, again, I want to cite her because she gave a really amazing speech at the Money Lab conference a few months ago about that. She said that all this money, all this quadrillion of dollars, which is generated also thanks to these machines of high-frequency trading, which acts together. They say finance is a social network, a very centralized social networks, and these are their machines. This quadrillion of dollars, which is this incredibly virtual figure, is not just staying up there, but it's being used to buy up real assets. So the immaterial production is being accumulated and expanded to buy up real assets, agricultural land in Africa and real estate in global cities. So that's where the exploitation takes place, in the way in which this surplus is not socialized, but again is invested in this. And this, she said, and I agree with her, is provoking a change in the DNA of society as such. It's going to be a different society which is going to emerge out of the process of consolidation of this huge theft of value which we are witnessing these days.
Okay, thank you. There was a question on that side that we don't want to skip.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really exciting panel and for great talks. I have a question for Tiziana Terranova, and it's probably a little bit critical, but I'm really in awe of what you've been saying, so I just want clarification on this maybe. And I ask this also because you've reminded us how important it is to be specific and precise when we think about those technologies and things that are happening in the background. Because I think probably more on a metaphorical level, you've been speaking about automata, about machines, about machineries, and about factories, and then also about algorithms. And it sounds as though you are blurring between those different concepts. All of those are more or less historical. Even the algorithm as a concept is historical. And so I'm wondering how you bring these, like the automaton as a 18th century concept of how we can conceive of technology, how you bring these historical metaphors, how you bring that together with your really very quotidian thinking about what is happening at the moment.
Automaton is a term in the automata. I'm very fascinated with automata. I did a whole course this year in my university on automata, and especially on female automata, because there's an affinity between the automaton and woman. You know, even if we think about films such as Hair, more recently, I think Scarlett Johansson has shot a trilogy. She has interpreted a trilogy of female automata, Ghost in the Shell. You know, there's a whole genealogy of that. So I'm fascinated by the word. I'm fascinated by the notion of spiritual automaton, which you find in Deleuze, and he takes it from Artaud. So the notion that we are made also of automatisms. So automata is not just a historical mechanical automata that you found in the 18th century, but it's what's the automatic and the habitual in us. You know, that movements which are involuntary, in the sense that you find yourself drawn to doing things without realizing that you're doing. It's about the involuntary and in the subjectivity, and not just in machine. So I'm intrigued by that term, and of course all these terms, automaton, machine, machinery, and factory, you find them in the Fragment of Machines. You find them in Marx. And in the Fragment of Machines, which when it came out in 1953, because it had been lying in here in Berlin in some archive, unpublished, for over 100 years, and when the Fragment of Machines came out as part of the Grundrisse, these terms, unlike in Capital, from what I understand, automaton, machine, machinery, factory, worked in such a way as to prefigure the idea that emancipation of work was about free time, surplus labor was about, that machines was about the liberation of work from necessary labor, a creation of surplus labor which could be invested in scientific and artistic activity, an artful kind of life rather than just a life directed towards reproduction. So that's why I keep using these terms because I found them in Marx, an historical piece, 1853, taken up again in the mid 20th century to rediscover, introduce the notion of refusal of work at the heart of the Marxist critique of capitalism. So the automata, the machine, the machinery are the means through which the notion of the refusal of work, rather than Stakhanovism, and I would like to say hi to Salvatore Iaconesi and Oriana Persico and thank them for bringing up Stakhanov again in this day and age. You know, rather than taking us towards an intensification to work, they take us towards a different kind of life. So that's why I brought them in. And the algorithm, I think it's nice to disagree. You know, one doesn't have to agree on everything. Otherwise, it's really this impossible harmony. I think a tour through extreme abstraction, sometimes it's very useful to get out of mental habits, to shake the automaton in us, right? Which makes us say and repeat things. It's, so I think that the book that Luciana Parisi wrote about algorithms is extremely abstract, but at the same time it's one of those books that kind of shakes your head, and at the end you come out not saying, you know, it's all the algorithm's fault, but understanding better what non-human agency is in the context of all these other agencies which are very human and social and so on.
Actually, I completely agree with you. So, you know, because in fact, one of the main things we've been trying to do in science and technology studies, as you know, and with, I mean, it's very identified with Bruno Latour's work, is to think about the agency of the technical and in what sense one can really talk about that and in what sense one can't. And I mean, so we're just moving along a, you know, a pendulum of what we're stressing for particular explanations, actually.
We have time for one quick last question. There's one from the middle here. Yeah.
So, thank you. Well, I'm really fascinated by this slide. It's too strong. This digital worlds and cultures and everything you said, it was really interesting. And at the end, Tiziana mentioned this common fair, co-production of research, working. Also, Judy maybe sleeping at certain point, like up to the end. But being an architect, I'm always thinking how to spatialize our digital, how to say, luxurious possibility of networking and being all connected and easily share what we are all doing, and how to really convince our conservative societies, I would say, in making open source their homes, lands, and skills, or even CVs, like doing real exchange. And in this sense, maybe we could also fight privatization of public space and cities, and maybe Greece would never happen if, or our society would never be in crisis if we were thinking better before economical crisis and tried really to think about open source resource in spatial terms, like in a real physical and material world as well. So yeah, that was not maybe comment or question, but yeah, some kind of.
Thank you. I just wanted to take this opportunity to again recommend you read Carlo Vercellone on Common Fair. We just got it translated. It's going to be up on Theory, Culture and Society website as part of this whole set, and this argument about the fact that common fare, including a minimum guaranteed wage or basic income for everybody, is not a question of redistribution of wealth, but it's a question of retribution of work which has already been performed. And to start from that process, that welfare is not a cost that workers pay for, and hence you have all this danger of people are like kind of taking advantage of the system, is based on the assumption that we do not share, you know, in this paradigm. If everything is productive, then a common fare is not paid for by work, but is paid just by the act of existing socially in this world. And it's very interesting, you know, the way he frames it in the article. So I would invite you, you know, to check out when Theory, Culture and Society is finally done with all the procedure, and they put it up on the website, because it's a very promising political line for this kind of discussions. So thank you.
I mean, I just wanted to say, I mean, you said you were an architect, yeah? I did hear right, yeah? And I think that's great. And I think one of the areas that hasn't been critiqued enough, and I'm hoping that architects like you will do it, is that I think a lot of the discussion of the Internet of Things is very focused on a smart house that seems to me to be so unimaginative, you know, that it's so much about these, you know, that I go into these companies and they say, won't it be fabulous to be able to control your central heating from your smartphone? And I think actually that isn't the most wonderful thing I could think of if I was thinking about an Internet of Things. So I think the spatial thing is, I mean, the huge new market is this Internet of Things, and I think underlying it is such a conservative notion of what the house is as a physical structure and as a symbolic structure. And so I think it would be great for radical architects like you to, you know, engage with that discussion. and broaden it out. Great. Yep, terrific.
Okay, thanks a lot for those concluding statements and for the entire your entire contributions, drawing our attention away from situating agency, but also like capture operations too narrowly in relation to digital technology. And also thanks a lot to the audience for your questions and participation. And I wish you a great evening. Thank you.